Okay, we are now recording, thanks. So tonight we have two guest speakers, Gar Smith and Tamara Lorincz, who will be presenting on this topic of the environmental impact of war. They really dedicated their lives to this very issue. We'll have 10-minute presentations from each of our speakers, and then we'll go into a Q&A portion. So I'll start with Gar and read his bio. Gar Smith is the coordinating committee member of World Beyond War and a co-founder of Environmentalists Against War. Gar is the founding editor of Earth Island Journal and author of Nuclear Roulette and the War and Environment Reader. Welcome, Gar.
Tamara and all.
You're now unmuted, Gar.
Thank you. Shall I begin? Okay. First, some history. From 500 BC to 2000 AD, history documents more than 1,000 wars. In the 20th century, we've had 165 wars that killed as many as 258 million people. World War II claimed the lives of 17 million soldiers and 34 million civilians. In today's wars, 75% of those killed will be civilians. Nature always suffers collateral damage in war, but nature itself can become the target of so-called scorched earth tactics. This is a long history going way back to the book of Judges in the Bible, which relates how Samson once caught 300 foxes and tied them tail to tail in pairs. He then fastened a torch to every pair of tails and set the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. Destroying crops, killing livestock, and poisoning water supplies have long been proven methods of subduing rural populations. During the American Revolution, George Washington used scorched earth tactics against the Native Americans who allied themselves with the British. And during the US Civil War, General Sherman's march through Georgia torched millions of acres of farmland. But the stakes were raised considerably when the oil-fueled revolution hit the enterprise of war. Mechanized modern armies no longer needed oats and hay to feed and fuel their horses and mules. In World War I, General Motors turned a tidy profit by building nearly 9,000 military vehicles. And of course, the arrival of militarized aircraft was also a historic game changer. During World War I, some of the worst environmental impacts occurred in France. At the Battle of the Somme, more than 19,000 British soldiers were killed during the first day of battle. And the nearby high wood was flattened by a fusillade of bombs and shells. With the outbreak of World War II, the European countryside was to suffer a renewed onslaught. Even today, bombs, artillery shells, and mines from World War I are still being discovered beneath European fields, waterways, and cities. And recently, wildfires broke out in the forests, and the firefighters were unable to address the fires because they were detonating buried weapons from World War II. The two nuclear bombs that were detonated over Japan's cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki also left a legacy. After the fireballs came a radioactive black rain that seeped into food and water supplies, triggering deadly cancers and mutations in plants, animals, and newborn children. Before the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed in 1963, the US and the USSR had conducted 1,352 underground nuclear test explosions and conducted 520 atmospheric detonations. In 2002, the National Cancer Institute estimated that the fallout had traveled around the globe, and the open-air testing had caused tens of thousands of cancer deaths worldwide. In the closing decades of the 20th century, the military horror show was unrelenting. While the brutality of America's wars in Vietnam and across Southeast Asia are well documented, Other interventions remain nearly forgotten. For 37 months in the early 1950s, the US pounded North Korea with 635,000 tons of bombs and more than 32,000 tons of napalm. The US destroyed, in the process, 78 Korean cities, nearly every city in Korea, 1,000 hospitals, 5,000 schools, 600,000 homes, and killed more than 1.5 million civilians. Most Americans have no recollection of these brutal years, but believe it, the people on the North Korean peninsula have vivid memories of this part of their history. In 1991, the US dropped 88,000 tons of bombs on Iraq, destroying homes, power plants, major dams, and water systems. And this triggered a health emergency that contributed to the deaths of an estimated 500,000 Iraqi children. Smoke from the burning oil fields in Kuwait released plumes of toxic soot that traveled hundreds of miles downwind. During its 2003 invasion, the Pentagon spread more than 175 tons of depleted uranium over Iraq, triggering epidemics of cancers and outbreaks of horrifically deformed children in Fallujah and other Iraqi cities. Let's face some facts. The US is the world's leading purveyor of war. It's our biggest export. According to Navy historians, from 1776 through 2006, US troops have fought in 234 foreign wars. Between 1945, the end of the Second World War, and 2014, the US was responsible for launching 81% of the world's 248 major conflicts. Since the Pentagon's retreat from Vietnam in 1973, US forces have targeted Afghanistan, Angola, Argentina, Bosnia, Cambodia, El Salvador, Grenada, Haiti, Iran, Iraq, Kosovo, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Nicaragua, Pakistan, Panama, the Philippines, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Ukraine, Yemen, and the former Yugoslavia. And now we are eyeing Venezuela. There are 933 members of the United Nations. Over the last 174 years, 62 of them have been attacked, invaded, overthrown, occupied, or policed by US troops. We even invaded Russia. In 1918, 5,000 US troops were sent to Siberia to battle the Red Army. More than 200 soldiers were killed before the US was forced to retreat. If the Pentagon's mission is to promote freedom, the most democratic nations on earth would be Honduras, Haiti, Cuba, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Colombia, and China. Why? Because they all have been invaded by US troops between 7 and 12 times. If the goal here isn't democracy, what then is it? When asked what triggered the Iraq War, former CENTCOM Commander General John Abizaid had a ready answer. He replied forthrightly, "Of course, it's about oil. We can't really deny that." And here's the awkward truth. The Pentagon needs to fight wars for oil so it can fight wars for oil. And here's the final irony. The military's scorched earth tactics have become so devastating that we now find ourselves actually living literally on a scorched earth, where industrial pollution and military operations have driven temperatures to the tipping point. Today, we face two existential threats: nuclear war and climate change, and the military is responsible for both. In pursuit of profit and power, extractive corporations and global armies have effectively declared war on the biosphere. And the planet is now striking back with an onslaught of extreme weather, packing a force that no human army has ever encountered. A single hurricane can unleash the force of 10,000 atomic bombs. Wildfires have caused billions of dollars in losses and lives. Hurricane Harvey's blitz on Texas caused $180 billion in damage. Maria's toll in Puerto Rico alone topped $139 billion. Florence is on track to reach $50 billion. Speaking of money, the World Watch Institute has estimated that redirecting just 15% of all of the funds spent on weapons globally could eliminate many of the root causes of war, including drought, famine, and poverty. So why does war persist? Why? Because the US has become what you might call a corporate militocracy, controlled by the arms industry and fossil fuel interests. As former Congressman Ron Paul has noted, military spending mainly, quote, benefits a thin layer of well-connected and well-paid elites who are terrified that peace may finally break out, in which case it would be bad for their profits. So today, our survival is threatened by gun barrels and oil barrels. To stabilize our climate, we need to stop wasting money on war. We can't win a war directed against the very planet we live on. It's time to put down our weapons and sign a peace treaty with the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Gar. For those of you just joining us, this is a webinar hosted by World Beyond War on the topic of how war and militarism impacts our environment. Our next speaker is Tamara Lorincz, board member of Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and former executive director of the Nova Scotia Environmental Network. Tamara has an LLB JSD and MBA specializing in environmental law and management. She is also currently a PhD student in global governance. Welcome, Tamara.
Good evening. I'm just going to load my PowerPoint presentation and make sure everybody can see it. Does my PowerPoint presentation appear for everyone?
Yes. You can put it to full screen too.
Okay. Great. So thank you, Gar, so much for your excellent presentation. In my talk tonight, I'm going to talk about the climate and environmental impacts of the Canadian and American militaries. I'm going to talk about military operations, military bases, military expenditures, and then I'm going to close quickly with some solutions. So let's remind ourselves of the climate and ecological crisis. So in the US Eastern Seaboard, there was hurricanes and flooding on the West Coast, in California and British Columbia. In Canada, there were severe forest fires and heat waves around the globe. And in all different ways, we are hitting planetary boundaries. The top headline in The Guardian today is this headline: World nowhere near on track to avoid warming beyond 1.5 Celsius target. Now, in my opinion, one of the biggest culprits is the military. So the US Department of Defense is the largest institutional consumer of oil. It spends approximately $17 billion every year. It's also the largest landholder with 800 bases in 70 countries. In Canada, the Department of National Defense is also the largest consumer of petroleum products and the largest landholder among all federal agencies. Military vehicles like tanks and fighter jets are very fuel inefficient. They have long life cycles with locked-in energy platforms that are very difficult to modify. Military emissions are exempted from national greenhouse gas reporting requirements and from reduction targets. So these exemptions can be seen in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2006 guidelines. These are guidelines that are required for all countries to report their greenhouse gas emissions. And you can find specifics about the military exemptions in those guidelines. Now, why does the military have these exemptions? Why does it get this special treatment? Well, I'd like to read you a quote from the former US Undersecretary for the Economy, Stuart Eizenstat, who in the mid-1990s was the lead negotiator for the American delegation at the Kyoto Protocol negotiations in Japan. And at a Senate hearing in February of 1998, he said this: "We took special pains working with the Defense Department and with our uniformed military, both before and in Kyoto, to fully protect the unique position of the United States as the world's only superpower with global military responsibilities. We achieved everything they outlined as necessary to protect military operations and our national security. At Kyoto, the parties, for example, took a decision to exempt key overseas military activities from any emissions targets, including exemptions for bunker fuels used in international aviation and maritime transport, and from emissions resulting from multilateral operations." You can see this clause in the Kyoto Protocol. It's Article 2.2. So now let's talk about an operation. The picture that you see here is a CF-18 Canadian fighter jet that's being refueled. Now, these are the fighter jets that Canada used as part of US Operation Inherent Resolve from October 2014 to February 2016 for airstrikes over Syria and Iraq. Since February 2016, Canada is no longer doing airstrikes, but it is doing all of the refueling for the US coalition. Now, these fighter jets were manufactured by McDonnell Douglas, which merged in 1997 with Boeing. And these fighter jets consume a tremendous amount of oil. So in 1 hour, they burn about 4,400 pounds of fuel. And the cost to maintain and operate these fighter jets are about $17,000 an hour. And these fighter jets require a specialized fuel called JP8, which is more toxic than commercial airline fuel. It's got toxic additives that are highly refined for fighter jets. Now, this is from the Department of National Defense website in Canada, and it shows more details about this operation impact. And you can see by the arrow that the Canadian Air Force has delivered over 60 million pounds of fuel to US coalition forces over the last 4 years. Now, this Canadian operation is part of a broader US-led coalition called Operation Inherent Resolve. There are about 30 plus countries that are involved in this operation. And the mission is to defeat ISIS or Daesh in the Middle East. Now, every month, the Operation Inherent Resolve, the US releases a monthly civilian casualty report, and it details the number of airstrikes. And so you can see where the red arrow is, that the US military admits that there has been among coalition forces over 29,000 airstrikes since August of 2014. Now, Air Wars, which is an independent consortium of independent journalists from around the world, they are based in the Middle East, and they are scrutinizing very closely Operation Inherent Resolve, and they are doing their own calculation based on reports. And so they concur that there has been about 30,000 coalition airstrikes, but they estimate that there has been 108,000 bombs and missiles dropped on Syria and Iraq over the past 42 months. And this has resulted in, sadly, over 6,500 civilians. One of the calculations that they don't do, because none of the militaries do these calculations, is what are the greenhouse gases? What are the climate impacts of this operation? Well, I wrote to the Minister of National Defense in Canada, Harjit Sajjan, and I asked him, is the Canadian military estimating the greenhouse gas emissions from Operation Inherent Resolve? And he replied, no, they aren't. So you can see a quote from the letter there. And then last November, the Canadian military released its very first defense, energy, and environment strategy. And in that document, it is very clear that they are not calculating their military emissions. So I'll quote here, "Given the unpredictable changes in operational tempo, the federal reduction target will not include emissions from military activities and operations." So let's talk now a little bit about environmental impacts of military bases. So military bases in Canada, the United States, around the world are private, bordered, highly securitized spaces. And these bases are used to train soldiers, store weapons, test weapons, and prepare for war. And on the bases, for their activities, they cause deforestation, they dump waste, the toxics lead to effluent and emissions. And we know from policy documents that the militaries in both in Canada and the United States and elsewhere are the largest consumers of hazardous material and also the largest producers of hazardous waste. So the toxic chemicals and solvents that they use are for degreasing vehicles, for preventing fires on the base from fighter jets or from other vehicles. There's also debris from munitions that are used, and there's also unexploded ordnances on the base and outside of the base, also accumulating in our oceans. And the remediation of military contamination is very costly, and often it's not remediated fully, and communities are adversely impacted. So in 2017, ProPublica did an investigative report called Bombs in Your Backyard, and they identified contaminants from military bases across the United States. And Americans can go to this website, they can type in their postal code, and they can find out more information about the contaminants coming from nearby military bases and what their risk is to their health. Then earlier this year in the spring, the Department of Defense released partially a report on water contamination at 126 bases across the US. And this is from perfluorinated compounds which cause cancer and birth defects. In Canada, if you look at the federal contaminated sites inventory, you can see where the red arrow is, that the Department of National Defense is one of the largest agencies with contaminated sites in the country. So if you go to this inventory, it's a public online database that you can find out more information about these contaminated sites. So for example, the Canadian Forces base in Valcartier in Quebec has been contaminated with trichloroethylene. At the CFB base in Greenwood in Nova Scotia, it's contaminated with heavy metals and with petroleum hydrocarbons. So in Quebec, at the nearby community beside CFB Valcartier, the community of Shannon was very concerned that trichloroethylene was leaching into the groundwater from the military base and contaminating their wells. And so they filed a class action lawsuit because they're concerned about their exposure to cancer, and this case is proceeding in Canadian courts. Then an internal Department of Defense audit showed that the toxic residue from munitions persists over a long time. So this study that they did was looking at a CFB base in Ottawa called Petawawa, and they showed that the toxic residue was in the soil after 100 years. So these toxics from military bases they're persistent, they bioaccumulate, and they're dispersing very widely, and they're appearing in adversely affecting animal health and human health. So let's talk really quickly about military expenditures. So the United States, as everybody knows, is the top military spender in the world, and Trump over the past 2 years has dramatically increased military spending, but at the same time he's cut the budget to the Environmental Protection Agency. For Canada is ranked 6th among NATO members for military spending, and we're ranked 16th in the world for military spending. Now let's look at these graphs that I prepared. The first one is from the Office of Management and Budget from the United States, and it shows US military spending over the past 20 years. So in 2016, for instance, military spending was $629 billion approximately, and the Environmental Protection Agency budget was $8 billion. And you know that Trump is going to cut that by about 30%. So it's a dramatic disparity. And the trends are the same in Canada. So I did this graph looking at military spending at the Department of National Defense versus the Department of Environment and Climate Change over the past 20 years. And in 2016, Canadian military spending was $28 billion, but spending for environment was only $1.5 billion. But we know that the ecological crisis is getting much worse, but environmental spending isn't going up. So this is a real problem because environmental military spending is depriving our countries from the resources that we need for tackling the climate and environmental crises. So my conclusion is that militarism and military spending are grave threats to the climate, to the environment, and to public health. And if we are serious about protecting the climate, about sustainability, and about peace, we must demilitarize. Just a quick suggestion of things that we can consider. One is conversion, and this is an excellent report that was done in the UK by the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, this report on arms to renewables. This is something that Canada and the United States needs to do. How can we convert our militaries, demilitarize, and instead invest in a green job strategy and a poverty elimination strategy? And then finally, we can raise awareness about these issues all during the year, but especially in November, when the United Nations has set aside a special day, November 6th, which is the UN International Day for preventing the exploitation of environment in war and armed conflict. And then finally, to conclude, I've just listed some resources that you can peruse after this webinar, and I look forward to having a discussion with everybody online. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. So you both have clearly laid out in your presentations the deep ecological impacts of war and militarism. Could you touch further on sort of the next action steps that we can take? And Tamara, I know you touched on it a little bit at the end of your presentation, but how can we mitigate these impacts as individuals and as communities? What are the steps that we can take? Gar, is that your hand raised?
I can't tell. My screen is just showing the PowerPoint.
Tamara, do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Oh, sure. Yep.
Okay,
Hello.
great. So either of you, Gar or Tamara, can answer that question. Please go ahead.
Well, I do have an idea. I'm a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, and one of the campaigns that we started a couple of years ago is called Demilitarize, Decarbonize. And we have these huge banners that we take at all the climate marches. It says demilitarize, decarbonize, stop the war, stop the warming. And we've been writing letters to the editor. We've been writing to the federal government. We've been informing environmental groups in the country, and we've been speaking out about this issue for the last couple of years. We're trying to raise awareness about the climate impacts of the military and the fact that we are not going to achieve our Paris Agreement targets. We are not going to achieve our decarbonization targets by 2050 if we don't seriously stop the emissions from the military. And the only way we can do that is by demilitarization. We need to stop the wars. We need to close all the bases, and we need to have a green economic transformation.
Gar, did you have any thoughts that you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, a little historical note. There actually was a time back in 1990 when Senators Sam Nunn and Al Gore proposed something similar. They suggested that the Department of Defense should take a role in monitoring environmental situations, conditions on the planet, and also take remediative measures to try to address efficiencies and impacts. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. More ironically, in 2008, Al Gore proposed a program to move the United States from reliance on coal and oil to 100% renewables within the next 10 years. Next 10 years, that would have been this year. So we've had opportunities that were signal opportunities, and they have been opportunities missed. So we must redouble our efforts.
So in my experience as a former organizer in the environmental movement before I transitioned to working for World Beyond War, I didn't really see these connections between militarism and the environment being made amongst, let's say, the so-called environmental movement. Do you have any thoughts about why that's the case? Is that the case in your experience? And if it is, do you have ideas about how we can better bridge these two movements?
That's interesting. I actually did a Google search to see what I could find about that question. And on one hand, I found a lot of links to stories about the Pentagon going green, but I didn't find anything about environmental groups going anti-war. And it seems kind of ironic because one of our premier environmental activist groups, the remarkable Greenpeace, got their start, bless them, as anti-military activists protesting a proposed nuclear test explosion off Alaska. And their mission is expressed in their name, in their founding name, Greenpeace. It was chosen to meld both of these major concerns into a single campaign. Greenpeace kind of stands alone. And I know from my experience with environmental groups, Earth Island Journal was a pioneer in its reporting on environmental issues. We had issues on the expected impacts of the pending Gulf War in 1991. The issue included an article by King Hussein of Jordan. And of course, the war happened anyway. And having published these 4 warnings, we had a sense of collective survivor's guilt that we tried to send out a warning. It was ignored. Out of that came the founding of Environmentalists Against War, an international organization of environmental, social justice, and anti-war groups. But one of the explanations that I've heard is that too many environmental organizations in need of funding struck deals with corporate America. There was a case in 2008, I believe, where the Sierra Club was approached by Clorox. They had come out with a new line of so-called environmental bleaches. And there was a big debate inside the Sierra Club about should we or should we not. And they did. They needed the money. The World Nature Conservancy, I believe, was also listed as one of the early adopters of corporate funding. It is a struggle. I remember Dave Brower, who's as feisty an archdruid as you'd find in the environmental movement. Somebody once asked Dave, what's the problem with dirty money? And his response practically was, there's just not enough of it. The idea being that you can use dirty money for clean purposes, but first you need the resources.
Greta, can I respond to that quickly?
Yes, please.
I had the very same experience as you did. My professional background is environmental law and policy, and for many years I worked in the environmental movement. And in that time, I was working with all levels of government, municipal, provincial, federal government, and I was always concerned that there was never enough money that we needed for water programs, for air, to deal with air pollution, to deal with marine pollution, to action on climate change. And I would say to the government, where's the money going? How come there isn't enough money to invest in our life support system? And I started investigating the public accounts. I was always, and realized that we were spending so much money on the military, so much money for war. And I also followed the news carefully, and there was always money for for buying light armored vehicles, to buy guns for the military, to recruit more soldiers. And I started investigating the environmental impacts of the military, where I used to live in Nova Scotia, one of the most militarized provinces in Canada. Became aware of the environmental impacts of the military and became very concerned. And so I actually, my peace work is very much informed by my environmental work, and I feel very fortunate that right now in my doctoral program at the Valsilli School of International Affairs, I'm able to do my research on the climate and environmental impacts of the military, because there are so few people that are working on this huge issue. Even in Newsweek, it was reported a few years ago that the worst polluter on the planet is the military. And so I'm very concerned that in Canada, none of the national environmental groups have a program dealing with this issue of the climate and environmental impacts of the military. Even the Canadian Greenpeace is ignoring this issue entirely. I'm not aware of any chapter of Greenpeace anywhere around the world that is focusing on military pollution, and I wish that it would, because its name is Greenpeace and it should be one of the organizations dealing with this issue. So I really think that it is critical for the peace movement to make very strong links with the environmental movement, to go to all of the climate rallies and marches with their banners, demilitarize, decarbonize, stop the war, stop the warming, because we really need to get this message out, because there is no hope for the climate or the environment if we don't get serious about peace.
Thank you, Tamara and Gar. We're now going to open up to audience questions and discussion, and I do see one hand raised already. I want to introduce Tony Jenkins, who is our education coordinator, who will be moderating this portion of the webinar. Tony?
Great. Welcome, everyone. Again, my name is Tony Jenkins. I'm Education Director here with World Beyond War. And we do want to open it up for your questions. And it's real simple. If you have a question and you're dialing in by phone, hit *9, and that'll raise your hand for me to see that you're interested. And if you're joining us via the webinar, if you're joining by a computer, if you click on the bottom of your screen on participants, it'll pop open a little participant list for you, and there you'll see a little icon to raise your hand. And so I see we have our first hand raised up. We have Greg Rolls. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. There you go. Greg, why don't you give us your question?
Hi, my name's Greg. Greetings from Wammarai land in Australia. As someone who's been interested in a little bit in direct action, and I'm currently hanging around with my friends who are doing direct action against coal, and I tried to get them interested in this webinar, but they're a small group of people who are doing direct action, trying to stop the world's largest coal port and other things around this continent. How do we stop people from feeling so overwhelmed whilst empowering them? Because I think we've all got the information, all the data's there, everyone who's aware knows, but how can we connect sort of people doing the academic and lobbying things with the people who are actually putting their bodies on the line and support each other in that, so we can actually use non-violent people power to make the changes that we desperately, desperately need? Thanks for all your time.
Great. Greg, Tamara? Gar, Tamara?
Well, we have a couple of crossover organizations, groups like Physicians Against or the Bulletin for Atomic Scientists. We do have these links, and we should strengthen them. Education is key, and activism is even more of a keystone. One of the things I'm going to do to energize myself, and anybody who hasn't done it yet, go see Michael Moore's new film. See it with a bunch of friends, come out and act accordingly.
Thank you very much for the question. I completely agree with you that we need nonviolent direct action, and what you're describing, needing to have links between people who are working on lobbying and policy, and then people that are chaining themselves to the fences and being on the ground. We need to build that movement. That's what we don't have right now. We absolutely need to link arms with the environmental movement. The peace movement needs to get bigger and stronger, and we definitely need to engage in nonviolent direct action. We're running out of time, and I couldn't agree with you more. There's a fantastic book that was written by a fellow from Australia. I'm going to look up the title and I'll send out a little message about it. But it's on this issue exactly. It's on the need to participate in nonviolent direct action to deal with the climate and military crises.
Great. We're going to take our next question from Heather, and just to let people know, again, remind them that this webinar will be posted on our website, so you can easily access it and watch it. And we'll share the links that that our speakers have mentioned. And I also want to let folks know that this is also the topic of World Beyond War's No War 2017 conference, and how we can build the bridges between the environmental and the anti-war movement. And so we have amazing resources on our website that we'll also be able to share with you as well. So I'm going to take the next question from Heather Kopanen.
Hello. I noted, are you both aware, the speakers, of the Navy sonar effects on ocean life? And I have several more questions.
Yeah, intimately involved. One of Earth Island's formative projects was the Marine Mammal Project. And that was a key issue many years ago. And it's been fought with some success. We've had more success with the dolphin-free tuna campaign. The military is quite a whale to go up against from our little activist skiffs on the sea. But it is a supremely worrisome issue, because the whales and the entire marine ecosystem are in a state of disruption at this moment, and we're seeing a lot of unusual die-offs and starvation incidents. And when you blast the oceans with sonar, you essentially deafen and damage the whales, and about the only thing they can do to survive is to beach themselves and expel their last breaths on a sandy beach somewhere. So big issue, and the government knows it's responsible.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that question. I'm very aware about the sonar from warships, for instance. For a year, every Wednesday, I protested outside of the Irving shipyard in Halifax, Nova Scotia, against the building of new warships. Canada is going to be spending $114 billion to build 18 new warships for the Canadian Navy. And we know that there's been evidence that that whales have beached, have died, and after there's been naval war exercises on the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast, off the coast of Canada. And so for a year, when I was protesting outside the shipyard, which was also shared the entrance with the naval dockyard, I had a sign that said, you know, sonar and explosives are hurting, are harming marine life and the ocean. And so it's not just the sonars, it's also exploded and unexploded ordinances that are polluting the oceans. I mean, they're just dumping this stuff in the ocean, and it's terrible. But all our countries, Canada, the United States, are investing billions and billions of dollars to modernize their navies, and we're putting these warships on dying oceans, right? We've got, you saw in my slide, we have now 500 dead zones in the oceans around the world. We need to be protecting our oceans, not militarizing them.
Thank you very much. Excellent information. Are, with the World Beyond War billboards and perhaps corresponding bumper stickers, are there any that are comparing the cost of the military versus the cost that's spent on environment?
I'll look into that. Certainly it's something that we've considered, and generally we work with local groups to make and choose targeted billboards that are relevant to their communities. But that's something we can certainly look at. Heather, I know you said you have several other questions, but I got several other people that I need to get to as well. So I'm going to move on to our next person in the queue, which is Robin Tobenfeld.
Thank you, everybody. I'm Robin here. I think you've got the Oceania speaking. I'm also in Australia, though I'm American. I'm coming to you from Yagara and Turrbal land, sovereignty never ceded. And I just wanted to comment that in the chat, I put a link. I'm with Friends of the Earth Brisbane. Our website is currently down, but we did in 2013 produce a report on the environmental and social impacts of US bases in Australia, really scratching the surface. So it's really, I mean, just the tip of the iceberg, and it sorely needs updating. And we'd love to work with people to, you know, broaden this out to a global report. And another thing, I see Alan Ware is in the queue. I did a little bit of research on the impediments to environment groups taking up peace as an issue. I'd love to chat about that more. But here in Australia, I think that environment groups are, including Greenpeace, that did take action against the first Iraq war and then stopped suddenly. I think that was because they felt it was not popular with their supportership, and they're reliant on, you know, donations. And I think the environment groups probably see peace as too political and unwinnable and impossible, too hard to message, and therefore there are numerous impediments. So one of the things we work on is trying to find those legal frameworks like UN, you know, abolition of nuclear weapons, to say it's not crazy and it's not too political. We have frameworks already, like nuclear-free zones, that we could be working on to demilitarize. So I'd love to chat with people about that further, but I do have a question, and that is, do you have some advice on how we can calculate the military's carbon blueprint? Even just the Australian military carbon blueprint, including its impacts over, you know, by supporting Australian military, intrinsically linked to supporting US militarism. And how could we calculate the carbon footprint, or we want to call it the carbon blueprint, to give it that environmental and climate change message?
It's a bit of a problem because the Pentagon by design is a privileged polluter. They're not required to report on their consumption or their pollution. So the best we can do is work on estimates. And the estimates alone are enough to be concerning. We can continue to demand to hold the Pentagon accountable in the meantime, and we should do that.
So in Canada, I have filed freedom of information requests to try to get information about the Canadian military's consumption of fossil fuels, and then the costs, and you know how they're trying to do the calculations. So I've got about 1,200 documents already, and I'm filing more documents as well. If you go to the US, there's something called the Defense Logistics Agency, which is the agency that oversees all of the purchasing and procurement of for the Pentagon. And you can find a little bit of information about the cost of the military. But for you in Australia and for other countries, you should file access to information and try to get this information. And I would love to hear from you to find out, what you get through those freedom of information requests. And then I would just like to mention quickly that book that I couldn't remember the title of. It's called Global Warming, Militarism, and Nonviolence: The Art of Active Resistance, and it's by Marty Brannigan, and it came out, I believe, in 2014, and it's excellent. And then I'd also like to mention quickly another great campaign, which is Code Pink's War is Not Green. They have great stickers, they have great imagery that you can use, and they also have a campaign, Divest from War. And there's also divest from nuclear weapons. And then, so we say what we don't want, but what we want is we want economic conversion. We want green conversion. Instead of a militarized economy, we want a green economy. So that's what we need to be pushing for.
And Tamara, you just got to the first part of Robin's question about the challenges of how we can kind of encourage the the environmental movement to take up the war abolition movement. And I wonder if either of you have a quick response to, or some advice for getting over those political hurdles or assumptions.
I have just brought my banners to rallies and protests. I have gone and I have spoken to environmental groups. I have sent them emails. I have reached out to them. I'm from the environmental movement, and I have reached out to my friends to say we need to tackle this issue together. So we are making some progress. We need to expand, and maybe this is where World Beyond War can show some leadership. Maybe it could help bring us together around the world, people who are concerned about this issue, and maybe we could design some great World Beyond War, stop the war, stop the warming kind of imagery that could help us in the work that we're doing in our individual countries.
And we have to try to find some allies in the new growing progressive tide in and approaching Washington, D.C. There's some interesting legislation that's just breaking, by the way, speaking of Washington. There's Senator Tom Udall has just proposed a bill to block the any unauthorized war with Iran. And at the same time, there's another move to end the war on Yemen. We've got about 20 bipartisan supporters led by California Representative Ro Khanna, attempting to invoke the War Powers Act to rein in an otherwise unrestrained world of militarism that seems to be ruling Washington these days.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to take this last question from Alan Ware.
Hello, yeah, thank you very much. Alan Ware from Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and also from the World Future Council. I had three things. One, Tamara, your presentation was fantastic. It wasn't just information, but it was really good graphs and visuals. If there's something like that you have available that we can take to the environmental organizations, that will help us in bringing them on board to the issue of dealing with the militarism as well. One that seems to be open to this is 350.org. I've been working with them in Germany, and already the 350.org is doing divestment from fossil fuel sector. But in Germany, they've agreed that when they're doing their campaigning, that they will also encourage, whether it's their city or the university or the pension fund, to look also at divestment from the military industrial complex, from the military industry. Now, a lot of that was based more on the issue of wars and the opposition to wars. They hadn't really come to it from the idea of the environmental damage from military. And I think that your information will help to spread, to lock this more into 350.org globally, because at the moment it's only a few of the 350.org organizations in Germany. But I met with Bill McKibben a couple of nights ago and asked him if he'd be interested in exploring this idea of adding in, divestment from the military industrial complex to the 350.org global campaign. And he said, yeah, let's have a chat about it. So I think, when I meet with Bill McKibben to take this forward, or you could also meet in Toronto, I think, with the campaigner for 350.org divestment, Yossi, who's based in Toronto. Having that information will be really, really helpful to get 350.org to take on the broader campaign of divestment for the military complex. And finally, the third thing, I think I agree with you that in order to build cooperation with the environmental movements, it's not just the opposition to the military, but it's how we can support the environmental campaigns. And one of those is like the idea of the money that's going into the military should be redirected towards protecting the environment, to renewable energies. And there are a number of initiatives along those lines. There's the SANE Act, Smarter Approach to Nuclear Expenditure Act, which Ed Markey has got in the Senate in the US and Blumenthal in the House, which is to say, let's slash the funding for nuclear weapons and put it into renewable energies and jobs and climate protection. And then this global campaign, Move the Nuclear Weapons Money, which is about that also, to say we can move the money from nuclear weapons. Now, of course, we can do broader for the entire military, but we've got some traction with the nuclear weapons at the moment because we've got this new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So we can encourage, governments to say, if they're going to sign on to the treaty, or if other states or cities want to give support to the treaty, one thing they can do is to look at moving the money, cutting the money from nuclear weapons and putting it into environmental protection. Thank you.
If I can respond quickly, Alan, to what you just said. In 2014, I was in New York for the big historic climate march in Manhattan, and I had an opportunity to meet with Bill Kibben, and I gave him a copy of the report that I had written for the International Peace Bureau called Demilitarization for Deep Decarbonization. It's an 80-page report. It was written in 2014, and it has a lot of the information that I've just said, but I need to update it. But I gave him a copy of it, and I said, I really want 350 to help make the links between the climate impacts of militarism and how peace has got to be central to climate justice and action on climate change. And we haven't seen anything yet, but I'm hoping. When I send out tweets and things like that and messages on Facebook, I always add, at 350.org, because I want them to know about the work that I'm doing. So I'm hoping they're going to pick up this ball and work with us on it. And I agree with you that a fact sheet needs to be created so that we all have this information. We can be sharing it in our communities, and hopefully World Beyond War will take the lead and bring us all together.
Tara, do you have anything else you want to add?
Maybe I should give somebody else the closing words. I have my resources on my PowerPoint presentation, and my email is on the presentation as well, and I'd be happy to take your questions and comments by email as well. So thank you for joining tonight.
Thank you, Tamara. Gar, do you have any closing words?
Maybe a couple more action items. Things we can do: get off oil. The Off Fossil Fuel Act, Representative Tulsi Gabbard's Clean Energy Bill, would make wars for oil obsolete. Another action, Bernie Sanders and Jimmy Carter have both come out to call for the abolition of the Electoral College and the United States finally growing up and becoming a real democracy with a popular vote.
Great, thanks. And maybe I'll turn it over to you, Greta, to close us out.
Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you to Tamara and to Gar and to all of the participants. We'll be posting this video online along with the presentations and the notes, so you'll be able to access this information later with links to everything that we've discussed. If you go to WorldBeyondWar.org, you can find our webpage that goes through various facts about how war threatens the environment. So we have a lot of resources there already that you can cite when you're going to environmental groups or going to rallies or protests or lobby meetings, and we'll certainly be expanding that page with more information as well. But thanks again, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.